Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to our session on day two of the African Investigative Journalism Conference, the Nairobi leg. We are about to be joined by Vukasin Petrovic from the DT Institute, who will be joining us virtually. There he is. Hi, Vukasin. I'll let Vukasin introduce himself, but just for those who might have just joined us, my name is Mark Renja. My pronouns are they, them. I am a project manager at Code for Africa, and I have worked previously at the Nation Media Group as part of their digital content team, as well as Java House. So for those of you who grabbed a cup of coffee this morning, you probably got it from a Java House. It's one of the region's biggest restaurants, and I led some of their digital marketing for them. And I've been at Code for Africa as well, where I work with the engagement team. And part of our mandate is to help our initiatives reach digital audiences and create impactful work and just show the kind of work that we're doing. And some of that involves, investigative pieces with, teams like iLab and so on, and PesaCheck, which you might be familiar with. And so, that's kind of how it ties into this session, because what we're thinking about constantly is just how to get, sorry about that. What we're thinking about is how to get that content out there online and make sure it creates an impact and reaches as many people as possible and changes behavior, because that's another important thing. So now that you've learned about me, I'll hand over to Vukasin, who will introduce himself and let us know where he's dialing in from.
Thank you, Mark. Just one favor, as I'm introducing myself, if your colleagues can allow me to share a PowerPoint presentation, that would be wonderful. So, my name is Vukasin Petrovic. I'm the Chief of Party for Information Access Fund, which is the project implemented by DT Institute. I will talk about the project a little bit more in coming moments. Just a few words about me. I have been working for the last 20 years in supporting independent media and civil society across the world, especially in societies where we are seeing democratic declines and rates of authoritarianism. I spent 15 years working across sub-Saharan Africa and had that privilege to work on several occasions with your colleagues from Kenyan civil society and independent media in Kenya. Before joining DT Institute, I spent almost 14 years at Freedom House, and also in addition to Freedom House, I worked for an organization that specializes in social and behavioral change. So yes, I had the chance, as I said, to work across sub-Saharan Africa, and what I'm also very happy about is that for almost 20 years working all across the globe, but in Europe, since last October, I have an opportunity to work with civil society organizations and media across Europe on countering disinformation and propaganda. So, yeah, that is briefly about me. Mark, just one more time question about sharing the PowerPoint presentation, because yes, I'm still having some technical difficulties, and it doesn't let me to put up my PowerPoint.
Sure. So thanks for that introduction, Vukasin. We'll just try and see how we can get your PowerPoint presentation up. But as we wait, would you mind just giving the audience an overview of what kind of topics you intend to cover today, and what you're going to be focused on before your presentation?
Absolutely. So let's start, with, as you said, the whole premise, for this presentation, and conversation is going to be about by journalistic storytelling treatments that expose disinformation and influence of operations usually fail to have much audience impact. And again, to just make a brief introduction and frame this discussion, DT Institute, organization that I work for, manages Information Access Fund, through which we support civil society and independent media that are countering Russian malign influence efforts across Europe. So we work in over a dozen of countries in Europe, including Spain, Italy, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Ukraine, Estonia, Moldova, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, etc., etc., etc. So we work in a variety of countries across Europe. And how we see disinformation, propaganda, and influence operations is more and more we are seeing the purpose of these activities, focusing not only on mass audience or not targeting only mass audience by exploiting social media and general, I would say, media platforms, but also more and more focusing on niche audiences or elites. So through disinformation, propaganda, and influence operations, Russia tries to influence and corrupt the political, business, media, and cultural elites, which in turn amplify Russian narratives. And as much as that is the case in Europe, that is increasingly the case in other countries around the world. And now, one thing that we realize, that our research shows is that actually in Europe, the major transmitters of disinformation and propaganda are domestic political and media actors. So that domestic political and media actors generally amplify much more disinformation and propaganda and play a willingly or unwillingly role in undermining democracy and democratic systems in the countries where they operate. So from that perspective, we are now shifting our focus to countering disinformation and influence operations, first and foremost targeting democratic actors and institutions. And then at the same time, we are moving away from trying to inform and educate the public about disinformation and propaganda. We are actually trying to mobilize public voices, and create social movements against the disinformation and propaganda. And from that perspective, our goal is to engage with the government to formulate and implement policies and practices that will discourage participation in these disinformation efforts. And, that is where we see a key role for investigative journalism. And I have to say, in our work so far, we have relied a lot on journalists, not just to talk about and counter disinformation narratives by providing accurate information, but by doing investigations of those that participate in these disinformation narratives, and by uncovering the links between domestic political and media actors and I would say, Russia and other malign actors that are actively trying to undermine the democracy and democratic values in European countries. Now, the major problem that we see with investigative journalism is that, there are unrealistic expectations from investigative journalism, and we believe that these unrealistic expectations hamper the ability of investigative journalism to be effective actor in countering disinformation and propaganda. And that is because we expect from investigative journalism to both, focuses on the general public, and, to increase their knowledge about disinformation propaganda, to, contribute to changing of their attitudes and behaviors, to mobilize the public and to organize the public. And at the same time, we do expect also from investigative journalism, to contribute to policy debates, to provide evidence for discussion between public opinion makers and decision makers about changes that needs to happen, etc., etc., etc. So effectively, the problem that we are seeing with investigative journalism and how it's used when it comes to countering disinformation and propaganda is that, we do expect investigative journalism to resolve all our issues at the same time. And we believe that is not necessarily, the best case and the best use of limited resources that are available for investigative journalism. So from our perspective, and something that we are trying to encourage our partners more and more to do, is that purpose of investigative journalism should be to instigate and provide evidence for a purposeful interaction between opinion and decision makers. And as I said, that the purpose of investigative journalism should be to contribute to policy revisions, new policy formulations, and implementation of policies. And from that perspective, I would say, rather than trying to dumb down investigative journalism or trying to make it more entertaining or more appealing to general audiences, investigative journalism experts should actually double down on use of data, use of applied political economy, analysis, use of social network analysis. Effectively, investigative journalism should be more of what it actually is. And as such, investigative journalism, especially when it comes to uncovering influence operations or malign influence operations in democratic countries, should be driving advocacy campaigns, should be assisting civil society organizations and other stakeholders to mount advocacy campaigns and engage with decision makers. And at the same time, investigative journalism should not try to do more than this. The purpose of investigative journalism should not be to mobilize social movements against disinformation and propaganda. Because, ultimately what is the purpose of investigative journalism cannot be married with what is effective content when we talk about mobilization. Media content that lacks appeal or substantial entertainment value, cannot retain viewers it reaches, and to make a substantial and long-lasting impact on the audience, especially when we're talking about behavioral change or a mobilization of people, and to initiate changes in thinking and behavior. So content needs to appeal to emotions, values, and audience aspirations. And those are not necessarily the things that investigative journalism in its nature, is about, nor that it should be doing. So again, I truly believe that investigative journalism should not be dumbed down, commercialized, or forcefully made to be entertaining. And that instead, investigative journalism should be seen as a part of holistic advocacy in public outreach campaigns, and that it should be used to inform public outreach campaigns. It should be used to inform engagement with broader public, with citizens, or again, with a very specific niche groups. And for that to happen, we should encourage mobilization. We should encourage. Hold on, now I can share my screen. So I apologize. I was trying to share my screen because I can do that, but I'm not sure exactly. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So, so from that perspective, for investigative journalism to successfully inform public outreach campaigns, we should collaborate with civil society and content creators. Civil society and content creators are better positioned to adapt journalist exposures to different audiences and platforms to ensure maximum scale. And even more, civil society organizations and content creators are better positioned to develop campaigns that can last for months and use persuasion techniques not appropriate for journalism. So from this, what I'm trying to, argument that I'm trying to push here is that, journalists and investigative journalism should not try to do what is not best positioned to do. Instead, it should collaborate with others that can take content and take narratives they are trying to promote and talk about and transform them into different types of content that can ensure greater reach and greater impact on public. And again, I don't need to talk to you about effective civil society campaigns and how they can reach the public, and continue discussion about important political or social issues. At the same time, when we are talking about who investigative journalists should reach out to and who should they collaborate to, we should not stop on exclusively engaging with those who do political commentary or report on current events. But we should also try to engage with content creators that make educational, do-it-yourself, self-inspirational or motivational content. In other words, we need to reach out to a wider group of content creators. One of the great examples of how conversation about disinformation can be transformed into a completely different type of content is it's a theater drama in Serbia that is called Editor, and that is inspired by analysis of disinformation in Serbia and the role that media play in both transmitting disinformation and countering disinformation. And at the moment, we are actually working with this group to transform its theater show into a series of podcasts and YouTube videos. Also, there are more and more influencers online that integrate social issues into their shows and tend to talk about and tend to combine murder mysteries with, for example, in this case, makeup shows with information about historic events in United States. And what I would say is, as we are thinking about making journalism, investigative journalism, or subject of investigative journalism more appealing, more effective, and more, I would say, accessible online, we should not think just about creating the standalone standalone content that solely focuses on the topic of journalist investigations. But we should also think about ways in which we can integrate narratives from journalist exposés into pop culture. And again, the critical thing when we are talking about social behavioral change, and when we are talking about creating lasting impact on audience, is production of content that is emotional and that whose content appeals to values and audience aspirations. Again, we are talking about the type of content that is not necessarily compatible with the way that investigative journalism works. So we have to, if we are to work towards inspiring social and behavioral change, and if we are trying to work towards mobilizing public voices against disinformation and influence operations, we have to create a community of content creators that is going to work closely with investigative journalism towards, creating content that has as purpose creating of a safe, healthy, and fully functional society. In other words, in addition to investigative journalists, we should start working with content creators who are willing to work in the public interest. So, from that perspective, this December, we are going to launch a series of creative challenges, and we are going to invite content creators across Europe to work on creating sci-fi stories, TV and radio drama screenplays, comedy sketches, graphic novels based on the work of debunking organizations and with investigative journalists. We are going to supply those that are willing to participate in this challenge with, again, specific analysis of this information, but then at the same time with the specific investigative stories that talk about how Russia exercised its undue influence in European countries. The whole idea here is, as I mentioned during this conversation, is to take further work done by journalists and to take it into areas and take it to the audience that otherwise would not be interested in reading journalist exposés. So, investigative journalism should not try to fulfill the role it's not well positioned to do, and should collaborate with other actors that can adopt exposés to different audiences and platforms to ensure maximum scale. From that perspective, collaboration with civil society and content creators is essential. Investigative journalism should double down on what makes it an effective tool for change, and that is creating purposeful interaction with opinion and decision makers to influence policy revision, new policy formulation, and implementation of policies, practices, and behaviors. Mark? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that very comprehensive and in-depth presentation, Vukasin. And there's a lot to dig into, and I'm sure the audience, both online and here at the venue, do have questions. But just to get the ball rolling, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned during your presentation that investigative journalism has had unrealistic expectations put upon it to try and fulfill, kind of roles that it isn't equipped to do. And I think part of understanding the problem is trying to figure out where that systemic issue comes from. So I guess my question to you is, what is the source of those unrealistic expectations? Are they commercial pressures to make journalism do something that it isn't, or is it from management, or is it just a cultural thing? Like, where do you think that pressure comes from to, that's put on investigative journalism to be something that it's not?
Thank you. And I think that it's a combination. Definitely we are talking about commercial interest, but at the same time, considering that lately more and more we see investigative journalism being funded, privately or, funded through donations of public donors or private donors. I think that overall the lack of understanding or the lack of, I would say, thinking out of the box how we can inform, educate, and then mobilize the public is, where that comes from, where people see, and see investigative journalism as the only way to do it. And I think what we are doing and where we are making mistakes is we are too much putting things into silos. So we are talking about investigative journalism working and collaborating between each other. But so far I haven't seen too many collaboration between investigative journalism and civil society. And I think that, that is our mistake overall, as societies, that, we don't have holistic approach to what we are trying to do.
Thanks so much for that question. There's another question here which asks, in your experience, what types of journalistic output most improve the disinformation and propaganda countering of efforts, and how would you measure their success?
Thank you. Okay, so look, there are, there's no one answer to this. News content has a role to play in countering disinformation and propaganda. Non-news content has also a role to play in countering disinformation and propaganda. Again, if we focus on ultimate purpose of disinformation and propaganda, and that is to undermine democratic systems and to undermine citizens' attitudes towards human rights and democracy and democratic institutions, we need to think from several different sides. One part is making sure that citizens are well informed about what is going on in their countries. The second aspect is that their attitudes and behaviors towards liberal democracy or towards democracy and respect for human rights stays strong. So when we are talking about attitudes and behaviors, we are talking about social and behavioral change content. And that is where non-news content and direct engagement have much more influence than your news content. So again, we need to think, in terms of not one or the other, but when and how, different types of content work well together. I have to say, more and more we are also focusing on countering disinformation and propaganda through, different types of interventions. So we are thinking more and more about strategic litigation as a way to increase cost of participating and supporting disinformation and propaganda, and effectively using strategic litigation to deter organizations or individuals from participating or supporting disinformation and propaganda. In the same way as we were talking now about, advocacy is becoming a more prominent way of countering disinformation and propaganda. So again, we need to think about, this in a very holistic way and deploying different tools and approaches, as, when they matter and when they can have most effect. To go back, just briefly to your question again, two more things that I would point out is, when we are measuring success, we have to measure success in two different ways. One is how much people in any given country have accurate information and aware of what is going on in their country. So understanding of current affairs is one important measurement. And then the second important measurement are their attitudes and behaviors, or their attitudes towards democracy, human rights, and their participation in political processes. Because again, as I said, those are two major things that Russian disinformation and propaganda is trying to undermine. It's trying to create confusion, it's trying to polarize societies, and then undermine trust in democracy.
Thanks so much for that answer. I see there are some questions online from our online audience, so I'll ask one of my colleagues here to read one of them out for you.
Okay, do you want me to read the questions, or?
One second, we're just getting someone to read them out.
Okay. Okay, I'll read the question. We have a question from Chris Cropper. He's saying, should investigative journalists stick to their lane and leave the influencing to the policymakers and more newsy editorial? Then we have another one from Chris again. He's saying, are there any platforms that investigative journalists should avoid ones that do more damage than bring benefits? Yeah, I think those are the questions from the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. So, look, let me start with the second one, and that is, are there any platforms that investigative journalism should avoid, ones that more damage than bring benefit? So I would definitely say yes, and the very obvious answer is is the TikTok. As I was, asked while I was preparing this conversation, if investigative journalists should use TikTok to promote their work. Again, I would say one of the major issues that we are facing today is lack of trust, or increasingly decreased trust that the population has in journalism and media. And I would say one of the major reasons for that is that journalism has tried to commercialize itself, has tried to dumb down itself, and therefore, started becoming something that it's not. So I would say, especially when it comes to investigative journalists, everything that requires investigative journalism to take forms that are making it less effective, that are making it less trustworthy, that are making it less genuine. Yes, journalists or investigative journalists should avoid those. Having said that, as I'm saying as I said in my presentation, investigative journalists should work with content creators that are present in those platforms to find a way to adopt and to inform and integrate work of investigative journalism into their content. Those kids or those content creators know much better how to engage with their audience, and they themselves should have this public interest in their mind and should be driven by public interest, and therefore should collaborate closely or at least be inspired by the work of investigative journalists. When it comes to advocacy, as I said, I truly believe that investigative journalism should drive advocacy and should drive and inform reforms. Frankly, if I'm seeing investigative journalism evolving into a specific direction, I see it evolving more into the direction of investigative journalism playing more active role in policy discussions, debates, and policy formulation than in opposite direction, which should be shaping public attitudes.
Thanks so much for that.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Thanks. So my name is Solomon Serwanja, and I work with the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. So there's an ongoing conversation around using investigative journalism as a tool for advocacy, and I am for it 100%. And when you're talking about the digital platforms and how we can actually let our stories go out there and have the impact, there's always that thin line between, PR, like for the project, like are you pushing so much of PR? Because so are you using the online platforms for PR, or good journalism should actually speak for itself, right? And of course I have my biases, because I think that you may do a very good investigative story that you'd want to use as an advocacy tool, but if people who are supposed to act do not watch it, then it is as good as not consumed. So a lot of the times investigative journalists concentrate so much about the project, and they don't so much concentrate about how do we get the project to actually be consumed and to be watched online. And this is why I'm really very interested in this session. So I would love for some clarity. Where do we draw the thin line between, pushing an investigation, or should investigative stories actually have a PR campaign around them to popularize them, even on digital platforms? I don't know if I'm clear. Yeah, so I'd love to get your comment on that, but as well as your comment on that, because you're so much also into the digital spaces, right? Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. And look, I would really love, to have a bit of a, discussion and about this issue. So again, from my perspective, the audience for investigative journalism, or primary audience for investigative journalism, are opinion makers and decision makers. And from that perspective, as I'm thinking about investigative journalism, I'm thinking how my piece can influence thinking of opinion makers and decision makers that are working on specific policy issues. I'm not thinking about, how my investigative journalism piece is going necessarily to mobilize the public. And I think that, again, that is one of the issues, that I see with investigative journalism, and that is that, again, it tries to do everything. Focusing on opinion makers and focusing on decision makers is, I would say, critical for the future of investigative journalism. Now, that is when it comes to the role that the journalists and investigative journalists have when it comes to investigative journalism. What I'm advocating for is that then, investigative journalism pieces should be taken by civil society, content creators, and others to then take it further and develop campaigns and develop public outreach materials that will mobilize the public. As I said, I don't see that is the role of investigative journalists. I don't see that is the role of investigative journalism, but work of investigative journalism can be used and by civil society, by content creators to take it, forward, to build on it in order to mobilize the public.
We have another question from the room here. We have a couple actually, so please go ahead.
My name is Agabo Shemei from the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. My question is about the digital transformation that has disrupted investigative journalism. And the question comes from this background of mainstream thinking. Most of can I call them the crop of journalists or investigative journalists, especially on the African continent, who have been in the face of mentors or who have been doing investigative journalism, have been approaching it from a mainstream thinking. And now we are seeing this digital journey, the digital transformation journey that has really disrupted the industry or the sphere of journalism. My question will be, one, how do we make our presence be felt in the cyberspace to shape public opinion as investigative journalism? Because we are trying to, like getting old wine skin into putting new wine into old wine skin, is we are seeing most of the investigative journalists right now who have left the newsroom and now they are mentoring the new crop of journalists who have this disruptive and digital thinking, but they are being passed on with a mainstream kind of thinking. And there has been a lot of friction in terms of storytelling and the output with the mobile devices now, which the audiences demand a certain kind of information, but we are still focused on long form. And so I want to understand, how do we tap into the mobile audience, but also keep investigative journalism afloat? Yeah, thank you so much.
Right, thank you. And look, again, I would try to focus now a little bit on social and behavioral change communication. Because what you're talking about is critical for engaging digital audiences. And again, this is why I believe that investigative journalism as such is not necessarily the best for social and behavioral change communication. Because when we are talking about social and behavioral change, we are talking more about just raising awareness. We are talking about shaping attitudes and behaviors. And in order to shape citizens' attitudes and behaviors, in addition to providing them with accurate information, we have to engage at the emotional level with them. We have to, engage with them, with citizens, in lack of a better word, fears and aspirations. And we have to use, different persuasion techniques in order to inspire them, in order to motivate them, in order to challenge their existing attitudes. And from my perspective, the question is the role of investigative journalism, or is investigative journalism the best position to engage with citizens at that emotional level? Is the role, or are we undermining credibility of investigative journalism by effectively using propaganda techniques, or using persuasion techniques in order to mobilize citizens, in order to shape their attitudes and behaviors? Because ultimately, what your public outreach is and what you do through social media, especially if you want to create a movement and if you want to make citizens actively demand, certain policy changes, or publicly to demonstrate their support for certain issues, is you do engage with them on emotional level using persuasion techniques in order to appeal to their system of values and beliefs. Question therefore, comes. And again, that is the central question to the argument that I'm trying to put forward. Is investigative journalism best positioned to engage with the public on emotional level using persuasion techniques in order to mobilize them and in order to actively involve them to participate in political processes?
We have time for one more question from the room. So I think Petrovic, you had a question.
So my question was, in your experience, and I think this can go to both of you, what type of content, and we are talking of news versus non-news content, what kind of this content best improves public's awareness about disinformation and propaganda? And I'm asking that because I want to know what types of about the types of content that have the most impact on the public's willingness to act. I mean, what kind of news content elicits the best response from the public on their willingness to act?
Thank you. So look, I will actually be more than happy to share very soon with you results of one of our projects. I don't know how much any of you are interested in what is going on in Central Europe, but recently, actually last weekend, there were elections in the Czech Republic, and one of our partners came up with an investigation about candidates for political office that are promoting Russian disinformation and propaganda. We are about to do a survey now after the elections to find out if their effectively investigative expose about politicians that are doing Russian bidding had any influence on the outcome of elections. What we know at the moment is that the political parties that had most of their candidates promoting Russian disinformation and propaganda didn't do as well as expected in elections. So we hope that there is some correlation between two. But again, we will do survey in order to find out if investigative journalism and that type of content actually had impact on the outcome of elections. But to answer to your question, and this is the same answer I gave some time before. Again, depends on what you're trying to achieve with your content. If you're trying to ensure that people are aware about current events in their countries, journalist content is much better positioned to do that. If we are talking about attitudes and behaviors, then your pop culture, and pop culture content is much better to do that. I mean, it's clear, and from when it comes to behavioral science, it is clear that two things are critical in creating norms that inform attitudes and behaviors, and that is social and behavioral change content that is, that is most often in the form of, TV, radio, drama that mixes entertainment, emotions, and conversations about norms and behaviors, and it's that content in combination with direct engagement with the communities whose norms you want to change. So news content for awareness, every non-news content for attitudes and behaviors.
Thanks. So, sorry, just one moment. I think in your presentation you mentioned, and this ties into the question that Kepratic has asked, which is, what is more effective? And you mentioned a creator challenge where, bringing together, investigative journalism and content creators who, will produce, elements of pop culture, like you mentioned.
Exactly.
And I wanted to ask, because obviously that's solving a problem. So would you mind talking us through how that challenge came to be and what kind of components you thought about including in it, and basically just give us your thinking into what that challenge is, basically.
Right. So look, a few things. Firstly, how it came to be. Again, what I was trying to present, now is based on years and years of, thinking how in a responsible way to influence or create desirable attitudes and behaviors of citizens, and how to mobilize public support for change, and then at the same time, how to make life of journalist articles, and especially investigative journalism exposés, more present in, I would say, public sphere. Because one of the major challenges, again, with investigative journalism exposés is that, their lifespan is not very long, and that we are talking about, a big storm, and a lot of attention about the issue, in a very short period of time. That's like 30 days after journalist exposes, something else comes up. And especially, in vibrant media environments such as Kenya, where one scandal, replaces the other one, and where a news cycle is so short that, things cannot last for too long. So, both these things, made us think, so how we can, as I said, put these two communities together and make sure that, work that the journalists do then continues to exist through the work of civil society organizations and content creators. Again, with an idea that, what is important here is not necessarily to inform the public, to the detail about the journalism exposés, but to focus more on audiences understanding the narrative behind journalism exposés, and then working with creative people to create narratives that are going to be appealing to journalists. So from that perspective, what in ideal situation, what we are going to do is we have a set of analysis and investigative journalism exposés that we selected as very relevant for countries in which we are working on. And we are already in touch with the journalists behind those exposés. So what we are hoping to do is effectively three-stage process where we are going to share publicly those exposés, invite known content creators from those countries to come up with their ideas for creative content based on exposés that we are going to share with them. At the same time, we are going to open this call to the public so that also everyone else can come up with an idea how that content can be created. As the second step, those that we shortlist, we will invite both investigative journalists behind those exposés and content creators to take their prototypes further, and to work together to make sure that what comes out of it in a way clearly represents what the journalists intended to do with their exposés. Then we plan to fund and to provide seed funding for several ideas, and then based on, I would say, initial success of those let's say prototypes, then to narrow our support further down to 3 to 5 I would say pieces of content that prove to be most effective, and to continue support and further development of those initiatives.
Yeah, that's such a great insight, and I'm sure there's so many more things we could discuss, but unfortunately we have to end. We're out of time. So allow me to thank you from the group in Nairobi. I'm sure they share the same sentiments, but thank you so much for your time, Vukasin. You've shared very valuable insights with us, and I'd advise everyone to just keep the conversation going, and thank you so much for being part of this session. And
thank you.
And yeah, everybody just have a great second day of the conference. Thank you.